Hello and welcome. You're listening to Road Resistance, a podcast in support of ORD2 Indivisible. I'm your host, Rhonda Nowak. Fellow Oregonians, I want to tell you that I've lived through a lot of political upheavals. I was born in the same year that President John F. Kennedy was assassinated. Then came the Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, Nixon and the Watergate scandal, the Reagan era and the end of the Cold War, 9/11, the Great Recession. But I never thought I would witness an authoritarian movement right here in America led by a radicalized GOP. Yet, here we are. But I think people may not recognize this as authoritarianism because that word conjures up what it looked like in 20th century Europe. But this is a 21st century American version of authoritarianism, and it's all spelled out in Project 2025's infamous Mandate for Leadership. One big idea in that 900-page policy document stands out front and center: the unitary executive. That's a fancy way of saying the president should have control over everything in the executive branch, even watchdogs like the DOJ and the FCC. The plan? Fire career civil servants, install political loyalists, and clear the path for the president to act fast without pushback. And how would all that power be used? By issuing executive orders. Lots of them. I'm going to kick off our first podcast by digging into executive orders and what they mean for democracy and for all of us. I know we all feel overwhelmed by the sheer number of executive orders, but it's critical to pay attention, not just to what's happening now, but to how it connects to what's happened before in the United States. Because history doesn't just repeat itself, sometimes it rhymes in very dangerous ways. So let's turn back the clock 83 years to February 19th, 1942. Just 10 weeks after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signs Executive Order 9066. With the stroke of his pen, over 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of them citizens, become threats in the eyes of their own government. No trials, no charges, no chance to object. They're told to pack only what they can carry. In Fresno, California, families close up their homes and report to the fairgrounds, turned overnight into the Fresno Assembly Center. That sounds pretty innocuous, but there's barbed wire and armed guards. The horse stalls are their homes right now. Children ask, why are the fences keeping people in? When are we going home? They wait for months. Then they're loaded onto trains, headed east to permanent camps in desolate places like Jerome, Arkansas, and Hart Mountain, Wyoming. For years, they lived behind fences for something they didn't do because of what they looked like and their label. Japanese. The American part was stripped away. History likes to wrap this up in the language of security, but this was fear. This was racism. This is what happens when executive power goes unchecked. Decades later, in 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed a formal apology. He finally called it what it was: a failure of political leadership and a grave injustice. What does it mean to be told by your own country that you don't belong? What does it mean to carry that exile into adulthood, into your art, into your memory? Today, I'm honored to welcome someone who can help us answer those questions. Lawson Fusao Inada is an acclaimed poet, educator, and former Oregon Poet Laureate. Born in Fresno in 1938, Mr. Inada is a third-generation Japanese American who as a child was incarcerated with his family under Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066. Those early experiences of displacement, confinement, and resilience became the roots of his poetic voice. His 1971 collection, Before the War Poems as They Happened, broke new ground. And his later work, Legends from Camp, won the American Book Award in 1994 for the way it gave voice to a silenced history. Mr. Inada taught English for decades at Southern Oregon University and served as Oregon's 5th Poet Laureate, using his platform to uplift poetry, diversity, and justice across the state. He's a storyteller, a truth teller, and despite being very busy, a generous guest. Mr. Inada, thanks so much for speaking with me today. This first episode of Rogue Resistance is about executive orders.
I know the executive order issued by Franklin Delano Roosevelt when he was president, and the executive order was number 9066. And so that kind of stamped in my mind because I learned after I grew up that that executive order had affected my life. I think underneath a lot of this is money. People want to make some money, and there's money to be made. So I don't know. At the very least, I mean, if I start getting rid of people, I can start deporting them. And maybe if I owned a trucking company or a bus company or airplane, I'd make money by getting some money to get them out of the country. When I had executive order acted upon me, a lot of people made money. You know what had happened to us, or to my family, and were the Japanese American people. We were recruited to help build up the agricultural industry in California. The same as I'm sure people from Europe and Eastern Europe were recruited to America as the labor force. The Japanese people were recruited. They were needed for farm labor. And so, my family and my grandparents were recruited. So they went to work in the sugar plantations in Hawaii. The American forces had gone over and taken over Hawaii and had started up a whole bunch of sugar plantations. Yeah, my grandparents came and worked as contract laborers over in sugar in Hawaii. And then they were recruited to be contract laborers in the industry of agriculture in California. And so, they came and, they worked and they did quite well. And I think by getting rid of us, people made money by taking over our property. And then on the other end, people made a lot of money by building the camps that we were put in. So, yeah, I was thinking, like, for instance, locally, we had Camp White out here in White City, and people made a lot of money by building that place. You know what I mean? There were deals that were made. Your poem, Prologue, from Legends from Camp, really gave me goosebumps when I read it because it's so eerily prophetic about what's going on today. The one part that really got to me. Here's the stanza. The situation obviously was rather confusing. It obviously confused simple people who would simply assume they were friends, neighbors, colleagues, partners, patients, customers, students, teachers, of not so much aliens or non-aliens, but likewise simple, unassuming people who pay taxes as fellow citizens and populated pews and desks and fields and places of ordinary American society and commerce. Rumors flew, landed. What's next? Who's next? I just find that very eerily prophetic. Oh, yeah, thank you. I appreciated that. I'm reminded of when we first started talking. I mean, both of us are curious or are interested in the other person, and so to me, there's not necessarily a them versus us. It's not me versus you. And then you got to think, well, where does that come from then? I mean, who do you think you are that you're going to think those other people something wrong with them or something? Yeah, I've noticed that. I mean, I don't keep up with a lot of the stuff nowadays, but I did notice that Trump is going to try to do something about the African American National Museum, which is located down the road from where he lives. I think he'd appreciate that if it wasn't there at all. And as for the Smithsonian, I think there's also a Native American National Museum located in Washington, D.C. And a lot of people would wish that those museums weren't there at all because it makes them feel like, oh, geez, maybe America wasn't all that great after all. Right. I think a lot of this has to do with the idea of identity.
I can see why your students would want to talk with you about cultural issues because so much of your poetry deals with identity and belonging.
But the thing about identity is, I used to ask my students, basic things like, who do you think you are? What is your identity? And, or what are you and stuff? And, I had some students would say, well, of course, I'm just your regular Oregonian. I said, well, what is that? You know, or kids would say, well, I'm just your basic American. Well, what is that? And you realize that people have deliberately developed amnesia or something and have forgotten or gotten rid of their original ancestry.
Let me ask you, how did your experiences as a child in the internment camp, how did they shape your sense of identity and belonging?
I was a little kid when I went into camps. I was like, I had just turned 4 years old. And when I get out, I was 7. And so here I am living with all these Japanese people. I was living in Arkansas in a camp down in the swamps. And then I got my family got transferred to a camp kind of like in the Colorado desert. I just assumed, I guess if someone asked me, well, what are you? I'd say, well, I guess I'm Japanese, you know,
Mhm.
as a little kid. But it didn't make much sense to me that, whatever I was supposed to be, I didn't really comprehend it. It took me to grow up to be an adult to comprehend my own experience. And the wonderful thing that happened for me was when my family came back to California, the changing demographics of World War II had brought about different population. So in my hometown of Fresno, I was raised in pretty much an African American and Latino neighborhood, and these were the kids that I grew up with, and it was wonderful because in a way, just living in a camp with nothing but Japanese people, it's not all that culturally interesting.
And I know that you went to 3 different camps, right?
It was
So
for
how
3
long?
years. We were there for 3 years. It's kind of unbelievable to think about it. First, we were living, just in regular neighborhood in California. Then we were moved across the town to live in the county fairgrounds, and then we lived in the county fairgrounds for several months while they were building a camp. And then we put on train and taken out to Arkansas by the Mississippi River. And, it was all arbitrary. I don't know who decided, well, these folks from California, they're going to go out here to Arkansas. And, the camp had been built, gone into Bayou. And then they closed that camp down. And the reason they closed that camp down, I found out on my own, was that America had captured a lot of Nazi soldiers. And so they captured them and they wanted to put them in a camps and stuff in prisons in America. And they chose one of our camps to put them in because it was kind of escape routes. It
Oh,
was in the swamps. It's kind of funny story. It wasn't until, oh, I don't know, the 70s or 80s, I started finding out about the Hood River, Oregon, for instance, that Japanese farmers and workers had gone into Hood River to work. And then after a while, they established the whole orchard industry. And then, that's why people wanted their orchards and got rid of them in the Second World War. And so it was money involved, and the people tried to come back and work in and build up the orchards again. And around in the Rope Valley, there was a couple of people had little farms, Japanese Americans, and so there was some Chinese restaurants and stuff, and there were a couple of Japanese grocers in Medford and stuff, and yeah, they got picked up and sent down to Tule Lake Camp, which is camp just below Klamath Falls over there. So yeah, that was a good old local camp. That had 18,000 people in it, and it was a good sized camp, and
that's a lot of
people could
people.
drive over there and kind of see where it was. Craziest thing because when I moved to Oregon, I had heard about this, the Tule Lake Camp. We weren't in there particularly, but I had relatives who were over there, and it's 18,000. So so I drove over to Klamath Falls and found the Tule Lake Camp area and stuff, and interesting thing was, it was the site of the so-called Modoc Indian War, and I didn't know that.
Yeah.
But I found over the years that as people ask me about my 3 years spent in what they used to call the internment camps or concentration camps, I realized that, well, that's kind of like a drop in the bucket, or it's just by comparison to, like, wow, how the Native Americans were treated. Gee whiz, that was something. They used to remove those kids from where they lived and send them off to boarding school. Yeah, there's so much history that we don't know, but it doesn't say that anybody was a bad, awful people and stuff. It was just the old them and us thing working, like yeah.
Did the camp have any kind of education?
It's depended on who was running the camp. They hired these
Uh-huh.
different administrators, and the one I was in Arkansas, they went out and they hired local people who were trained teachers, and so they came in and were teachers in the schools. Whereas in other camps I've heard, they just kind of had haphazard schools and didn't have much schooling. So it depends on which camp you were in.
How did you spend your time in the camp?
Oh, I remember, running around a lot and wandering around. I mean, it was pretty severe living because if you're going to build a camp somewhere, and I'm sure they did this out here at Camp White, you're going to put in one of those kind of installations. First, you bulldoze the ground, you clear out the land. And so then you put in some buildings on there. But because you've cleared out the land, when it rains, it's just going to get all muddy. And then when it dries up, it's going to get all dusty. And so, yeah, each camp was like that. They bulldozed the ground and then they stuck in these barracks. And it was quite a big deal for families because, there was no plumbing in the barracks. So in each block of barracks, there would be one building that was the lavatories, the latrine, you see. So you won't go to the bathroom while you wake up, and then you walk over down the road down there to the latrine.
Wow.
So it wasn't quite like they have a military installations in barracks, but then all of those have running water and toilet facilities, but no, the camps did not have those, so that was something. And then of course each family had a room, and so when you wanted to eat, you had to go over there by the latrines to this building called the meth hall. And, they fixed up whatever they wanted to do for you. Yeah, it was something. As I said, it was compared to, it wasn't slavery and it wasn't the Holocaust and it wasn't the reservation and it wasn't all of this and that. And we've had enough of all of those other kinds of things go on in the world.
Very curious. Were your parents surprised when FDR issued the order? I mean, did they see it coming? What was the atmosphere, around that time?
I think I think it just sprung on the people. But it turns out from what I've been able to gather that the FBI got involved early on, kind of did some undercover surveillance in our community because, so after December 7th, kind of like by December 8th, the FBI swooped into our communities and took away community leaders. So I remember the man down the street was affiliated with the Buddhist temple. They took him away, old man, and they took these community leaders away to parts unknown, and the families didn't know where these people were. Like that old gentleman who was our neighbor, he was affiliated with the Buddhist temple, and he was the master of the tea ceremony. He would teach, he knew a lot about Japanese culture. So they took him away. His family didn't find out where he was until about a year later. He was in a camp in Louisiana. It's called Fort Livingston, Louisiana. I mean, so all the stuff had been planned. It was all done in secrecy. I don't quite know exactly how things were going on. But in California, it's kind of disturbing to realize that, in California, well, in Oregon too, the Ku Klux Klan was still pretty prevalent and was, out front, and they would march in parades and they would have gatherings and stuff. And, they've since kind of went on undercover. But And then the Klan would have representatives in Congress, in the state politics and stuff. So a lot of that was planned in advance, I think. People just said, well, let's see what we can do here.
Did any of your neighbors, did anybody complain when people started being taken away and disappearing?
I think what happened to us was that it was very fearful. It's kind of like they take away your dad and your grandfather and you don't know where they are. So you don't go out there and protest about it. You don't know what they're going to do to these people. And then in those days, there wasn't that tradition of like, we're going to protest and march around and everything. So in a way, the way I look at it, the government took hostages. They took these old people, the old men, and who are our leaders in the community, the grandparents. And so, yeah, there wasn't much that could be done about it. And they had, the military had a presence then. We had a lot of friends, though. We weren't just, living in a Japanese enclave. We had Chinese neighbors, Italian neighbors, German neighbors. And it was a wonderful thing because, these people, we had been neighbors for, decades. And so what happened to my family was that my grandfather had a business. He had a fish market in Fresno, which he had founded in 1912. And so when we were taken away, an Italian family told him that we'll take care of your fish store for you, and then a German family came and told him like, hey, you're being taken away. We'll watch over your house and we'll rent it out for you, and this and that, this and that. The funny thing is, here we're at war with Italy and Germany, and these people are taking care of our property in Fresno, 'cause they were old friends. We were friends for decades.
Oh,
Yeah,
that's real life. That's what really happened in situations like this. Your family, they were neighbors of these other
yeah,
people. And so
yeah.
they reached out and offered their assistance in times of need.
Actually, we witnessed something like here in the valley, because after that big fire, the Alameda fire, man, and burned through, it burned through Talent and Phoenix and went up into Medford. I mean, wow, people really, really pitched in neighborly, helping the folks out. You know what I
Absolutely.
mean? Whatever so-called nationality or ethnicity or whatever you were. I mean, if you got your place burned out, people would help you out. And so I,
So
I,
it
I saw
sounds like
that. I
it,
witnessed that. Yeah,
it
I
sounds
witnessed
like there
that here.
wasn't so much resistance because people were afraid, but that
Yeah,
they offered their assistance instead.
yeah. And people got housed and taken in and stuff the, in the fire. And yeah, that was a good example of how things are. Can be.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that leads me to I want to know, did your experience in the camp, I mean, did it have any influence on your decision to pursue poetry?
Well, that has to do with another side of my background. You see, a lot of people from Japan, they came over here and they were peasants, but then they still had a tradition of education, you see. So they were educated. And so when they came to this country, like when my grandparents came to California, they saw education as being a way of improving your lot. And so I have a lot of people in my family who were my elders who became college graduates. So it's like it's really kind of amazing. Grandparents come over, they can't speak English. They raise these kids who learn English and went to college. And the California system of college at the time was like, it didn't hardly cost anything. You can go to the University of California, Berkeley, if you wanted. You know what I mean? So what happened in my family was like, geez, my dad was raised on a strawberry farm. His parents were sharecroppers, but then they sent him to college, and he went to San Jose State, and then he became a dentist at the University of California. And then my mom went on to college in California, and she had a teacher credential as an English teacher. And so when we were taken away, my dad was just starting his practice, and my mom didn't have a teaching job yet, but my mom was so well educated that, yeah, I became her student. And so she taught me all of this, everything, how to read and teach me how to all about literature and everything. So I was jump started. So by the time I was going to grade school and high school, I was already kind of like an English major. Isn't that funny?
Do you remember the very first poem that you ever wrote?
My first official one, I guess, was by the time I was in college. But I had been kind of writing, little poems and stuff since I was a kid. I remember making a Mother's Day card and writing up a little old poem. And yeah.
How do you perceive the role of art and literature, particularly, in confronting social and political injustices of our time?
Oh, well, as a teacher, I did it through my classrooms, and then during the '60s, when I was publishing and everything, a lot of the writers that I knew, we would go out and give poetry readings, and we'd be get invited to schools, and a lot of what happened in my work was that we were trying to establish at the educational high schools and colleges, more of a multicultural education. So when I went to college, and I went to good colleges too, I went to Cal and stuff. It was all English and Anglo-oriented literature. So if we studied American literature, it would all be about writers in New York City, and they were the ones who were famous and winning the prizes. And so there was no multicultural literature presented after classes, and that's changed. So that was one of the wonderful things that happened during the '60s.
What advice would you offer to emerging new artists seeking to use their creative voices to address and resist injustice?
Oh, well, I think first of all, I don't know if you want to get involved as an artist first, as a creative person, and then you could take on the injustices. But first, you develop, your craft or whatever that is. Your writing, your painting, your music. You work. That's the ground level that you work at. Take it from there. I just noticed within the last couple of months that thanks to the Alameda fire, boy, things are really happening in Talent, Oregon regarding the art. Well, I went to an event at a place I think it's called the Maker Studio. And right there in downtown Talent, there's this wonderful building that is just for artists. And you could go there and you say, I want to use this space or I want to use some of this equipment. And it's next to this big, formerly burnt out place that's now an art gallery in Talent.
What I hear you're talking about is the idea of building community with other artists. I think that is
Yeah.
part of what the ORD Indivisible is trying to do. And I'm really interested in this idea of creative resistance, using art, whatever your art is. We have this one group, they are knitters, and they sit in the plaza in Ashland with their protest signs and knit.
That goes in the opposite direction of executive orders and stuff. Has to do with your individual spirit, and that cuts through all of that stuff.
I often think that people get really creative when they are resisting something. In times of
Oh,
certain
that's true.
things, like people really find their creativity to be useful.
Well, well, yeah, I know that. I know that because you could be a creative person and sit at home and stuff, and you're kind of working in a vacuum, but when you work with others and you have some issues you can unite behind and stuff, boy, that really gives you some motivation. So yeah, I like that. I like yeah, you got your hand on the pulse there.
Thank you for saying that. Yeah. All right. Well, very nice to meet you, Mr. Anada.
Best of luck with this podcast stuff. And I appreciate that. You're really putting out good vibes. We need it in these times.
Hearing Mr. Inada speak about the lasting impact of Executive Order 9066 is a powerful reminder that what's written from behind a desk in Washington can reach deeply into everyday lives. To help us understand the onslaught of executive orders just 4 months into the Trump administration and how they're affecting Oregonians right now, I talked to local attorney and constitutional expert Garrett West. Hi, Garrett. Thanks for lending your legal expertise on our topic of executive orders. So, to begin with, I want to read from Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. That part's called the Executive Order Clause. So here's Section 1. It reads, "The executive power shall be vested in a President of the United States of America." And then Article 2, Section 3 reads, "The President shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed." Now, Garrett, to me, this language is pretty vague to be interpreted as the constitutional basis for executive orders, because it certainly doesn't explicitly mention them. What do you think?
Well, thanks so much for having me, Rhonda. I really appreciate it. The Constitution is a framework. It's inherently broad and vague in certain areas and narrow and specific in others. The Constitution does not mention the words executive order anywhere in its text. And it's funny because I think executive orders in the history of the Republic, they're a relatively new invention. Before this, presidents communicated with department heads through letters, asking for certain information or telling them to do something. Or they communicated with the public through proclamations. But executive orders really came into being as we know them from Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, when there was a military necessity to order certain department heads and federal troops to do or not to do something. And I think that's really the key distinction, because when people hear that there's a new executive order or that the president has commanded something, there's this feeling that it's a law. It's a new law ordered by some kingly figure far off on the other side of the continent. But executive orders matter a lot when they come to our civil liberties, because they can tell federal workers how to interact with us. For example, there's this latest executive order by Donald Trump attempting to limit citizenship, like who can become a United States citizen. The 14th Amendment of the Constitution is very clear on who gets to become a citizen automatically. If you're born in the United States of America on our soil, you're a citizen. Now, what he's done is issued an order that says, State Department, other federal employees, do not give social security numbers, do not give passports to babies who are born in the United States to parents who are not citizens, right? So all of a sudden, those children who are citizens according to the plain text of the Constitution are going to have to fight for the right to be recognized as citizens. You could think of all the rights that come off of citizenship: the right to vote, the right to be on a jury, all those core principles that we've fought and died for over the centuries in this country, they're at risk again.
That is right. And I think that the whole idea of birthright citizenship and trying to limit that within an executive order is, I mean, it's going to turn into an implementation nightmare. You've got, some states that might allow that and some states not. And so, we're going to end up with a lot of babies who are basically stateless. They're not citizens of anywhere. To your point, what are the ramifications of that in terms of day-to-day processing of voting rights and all of the other things that you mentioned?
You're exactly right. If we were to return to a pre-Civil War framework where each state is determining who is a citizen and who's not, you can imagine the chaos that would come about. Oregon would be recognizing citizenship of people who were born in Oregon, and then those people go across the border to Idaho or California, Nevada. Are those states going to recognize those people as American citizens? It really begins to destabilize the entire constitutional order.
And I also think that when we talk about this order in terms of immigrants, it's important not to miss the overall issue at stake here, which is what you began with, and because it really does define who gets to become an American citizen.
Exactly. Step one, say the plain text of the Constitution doesn't mean what we've always known it to mean. Immigrant children are not citizens, but who's deciding who's a citizen? We go from a bright line rule. If you're born here, you're automatically a citizen, to something more like, I think this person might be a citizen. I'll give them a social security card. Well, I don't really feel like I like these parents. I'm not giving their children a birth certificate or a passport. It's alarming.
It is very alarming. Since you started there, I'm assuming that you regard that particular executive order about birthright citizenship one of the most troubling executive orders that have been issued since January 20th, 2025. But there have been, I think, more than 150 executive orders. Can you give me other examples of the orders that you feel are most constitutionally troubling?
Absolutely. So it's not just the birthright citizenship executive order that's troubling. There's this pile of executive orders that has been issued. Normally, issuing a lot of executive orders wouldn't be cause for concern, but it's the way these are strategically aimed at destabilizing the Bill of Rights. We have an executive order revoking security clearances from certain individuals who are political opponents of the administration or law firms who represent the political opponents of the administration. That's an attempt to deprive people of their right to legal counsel in our courts. This is such a fundamental right. It exists long before the United States was ever established. This has been around for many centuries, the right to not only go into court before a judge, but to have someone advocate for you. Because in these many legal cases where there's national security implications or confidential documents, not any attorney could just go into the Department of Defense to review those documents or to the Department of State to review those documents. There have to be lawyers who have pre-clearance to go in there to make sure they can view these documents, determine what is necessary for trial, and what other things must be kept secret in the national interest. But if no one is allowed to go in and review these documents in order to present a fair defense, how could anyone say you have a right to defense in a courtroom? If the executive department is going to go around arresting people and bringing them up on charges, how can they defend themselves now? That's a really core concern.
And that's if people can afford to have a lawyer. I think one of the Supreme Court justices made the comment yesterday that it seems that we're moving into an era where unless you have a lawyer and are able to defend yourself, you're really at a disadvantage in trying to retain your civil liberties.
Exactly. I mean, you can see how these things start to have ripple effects. It's not this one thing and then that's where it stays. The consequences of it move on and on and on. And who knows where those things end, because all of our greatest thinkers think that is not a road we should go down.
Well, what legal strategies is the ACLU using to push back against executive overreach?
I'm not with the ACLU, so I'll preface everything I'm about to say with that. But the ACLU is distinctly and best positioned to litigate these kind of issues in the federal courts. They are highly intelligent people who work for the ACLU, who know the best kind of cases to initiate lawsuits in. They know the ins and outs of the federal courts and federal litigation. Like, that's step number one in any of these problems. Let's file a lawsuit. Let's get into court. But that's not sufficient, because there's going to be times when we win, but because the courts have been overrun by so many far-right extremists, there's going to be many times when we are losing, when any time in the history of the United States we would have won.
Simply because there are so many cases and such a backlog?
There's so many cases. There's so many judges now in office who are not qualified, who do not have loyalty to the Constitution. And so no matter what reasonable, good arguments presented to them, they will not rule in favor of upholding Constitution.
Oh, that's distressing.
It's a very big problem. There's many people who cover their ears and just want to pretend it's not happening. I think we have to face reality.
Wow. And it just seems like there are so many cases being litigated that we're into years of a backlog in trying to get some of these things adjudicated.
Absolutely. Overwhelming the country with all these executive orders is intentional. It's not like we have to fight one battle. We have to fight hundreds of battles simultaneously. And they can shift the resources of the federal government around at will, to determine which cases they want to put resources behind, which ones they want to string out and delay. It's a massive undertaking, but we've got to do it, right? Step one, we've got to go to the courts and say, there is a wrong. Please redress this. Please protect the constitutional order. But there's other things we have to do as well. It's not just going to judges and hoping that they'll do the right thing. There has to be statewide and local resistance to any unconstitutional acts. And that's a big ask, right? Because for so many of us, we're overwhelmed by work, family, other commitments, that finding time to make your voice heard, that's a lot to do. I think the easiest way people feel heard is by engaging on social media because it's really quick. Type, and it's on Facebook or Instagram. I think the most powerful thing people could do is to interact one-on-one with their local and statewide elected officials. I'm a member of the Medford City Council, and we have very few people come to our city council meetings to give comment. We have very few people putting in emails to us about things they're concerned about. I get some, but really not that many. If I see a lot of people messaging me or coming to a council meeting about something, I'm going to pay attention. If I have a lot of people doing that, I might become alarmed. And even though I'm not in Congress, I'm not in the federal government, I know who is and who their local people are. So if I'm being told there's a massive problem with the federal government, I'm going to be reaching out. And I know other people in local government, they have the same contacts and they do the same thing. If you really want to make your voice heard, talk to your local elected officials and get them to pressure their friends in the federal government.
I think that's an excellent idea. And that really does make people feel like they can do something specific.
Yeah.
Going back to the executive actions and talking locally, what risks do communities like ours in Southern Oregon face if these executive actions go unchecked?
I think it's often hard for us on the West Coast, especially in Oregon outside of Portland, to connect with what's happening nationally in Washington, D.C., and to see how the things being done there ripple through our communities. But I think the most important thing to understand when it comes to these kind of efforts is the slow degradation of our legal system, our justice system, our governments at all levels. When the edges start to fray, they don't stop fraying. They continue on. And 1 year might be this, 10 years from now, there's going to be a lot more fraying. Think about all of the families we have in Southern Oregon or Eastern Oregon where there are immigrant parents or maybe even undocumented parents, and their kids go to our schools. Their kids need some medical assistance. Their kids are going to graduate from our schools and be part of our community. This executive order specifically directed at citizenship is trying to take away their rights. How's that going to impact us? How's that going to impact our schools when they have students who the federal government says do not qualify for any benefits, do not qualify as a student?
I was at a recent school board meeting, and one of the school board members talked about the real fear that the immigrant community is having here in the Rogue Valley and how it's impacting attendance levels. Some students are afraid to go to school because they're afraid that when they get home, their parents may be gone.
Absolutely. And I think many people who support these efforts have this strong emotion of wanting our resources and especially our schools to be exclusively for Americans, as however that person defines them. And I think it's a very negative emotional state to be in. But I often want to ask these people, okay, so you exclude these children from our schools and they don't receive an education. And then in a decade, we have an entire class of people who don't have an education in our society. Do you understand what the economic impact that will have on our community? It will be devastating.
Massive.
If we're really just going to be utilitarians and think about numbers, we will not have a strong economy if these kind of consequences play out.
Can you think of any other executive orders that would have a particularly adverse impact locally?
I'll go with our theme and say that executive order that wants to declare English the official language of the United States. I've read my Constitution many times, and I don't remember the president being given the authority to set an official language. What this executive order is doing is saying that federal agencies and federal officials, it's directing them to not provide any services to those who don't speak English. That's cruelty, just straight up, right?
Well, as an educator, I go back to how is this going to impact the students in our schools? How is that going to impact ESL programs?
Exactly.
It is something to really think about. It really puts America behind. The things that we've been arrogant about is the idea of English as the international language. It has provided less of a disincentive to learn other languages. Yet in today's world, if you only know English, you are at a disadvantage. An impact of that executive order would be a reversal of the call to have Americans learn different languages so they can participate in the international community more effectively.
Absolutely. You hit the nail right on the head. Think of all the people who would have come to our country to teach our children their native tongues who will not be coming now because of these executive actions. Think about the executive actions related to the tariffs that are destabilizing the global economy. I think of this as steps. Tariffs to put up walls to destabilize the global economy. Other countries start rejecting the US dollar as the international form of currency. Step 3 is they're going to turn away from English as the international language. They'll adopt other languages to conduct commerce. And then we're left with a country where we only have one language spoken or read, and we cannot even do basic commerce with other parts of the world.
I
Like
think
that's
that's
a disturbing.
more isolated.
Yep, exactly.
Very disturbing. Let me ask you this. Do you have any examples of any local litigation that has taken place to your knowledge based on any of these executive orders?
Yeah, it's still early day. Obviously, there's litigation initiated by the state of Oregon against the federal government in regards to many of these executive orders. I'm not aware of anything locally that has sprung up in the courts yet, but I will say that there have been many communications between our local governments and our federal representatives about what's happening. I had the opportunity to speak with Senator Wyden in Washington, D.C. last month about many of the things that are happening locally, including our concerns about how the tariffs are going to be impacting our local economy. If we really can't import Canadian wood, I don't know how we're going to build more homes to solve the housing crisis, as one example.
Wow. You mentioned a little earlier the importance of people not being afraid to get out there and make their voice heard, whether it's contacting congressional members and voicing their opinions or showing up at a city council or a school board meeting. but also getting engaged in grassroots organizations that are out there defending democracy. I know you are part of ORD2 Indivisible. And so I wanted to know why did you choose to become a part of that organization? What do you think the importance of those types of grassroots organizations, what's the importance of them?
You're exactly right. Any way that you can step up to help preserve American democracy, do it. It's critical. I'm a big believer that we're stronger together, that two brains are stronger than one, that three brains are stronger than two, and so on and so forth. Being organized in times like this is critical for our future. So, I see Indivisible as a group who wants to advocate for the preservation of American democracy, full of different people volunteering their time and skills in whatever way they can to advance that cause and holding our elected representatives accountable. So I see it as necessary. I see it as allowing me to do the things that I can to aid in this rather large cause. And I would very much suggest to everyone else, if possible, even if you have a few hours a month, to do the same.
And what protections do citizens have when it comes to protesting and organizing and speaking out against the Trump administration?
So legally, we have an enormous array of protections. The First Amendment is very clear that there is freedom of speech in this country, that there is the right to assemble, that there is the right to protest. But at the end of the day, the Constitution is just a piece of paper. It is only as strong as we make it. If no one gets out there to exercise their free speech, right of assembly, or to protest, that right slips away. Historically, when Americans have gotten organized, made themselves seen, and made themselves heard, the federal government and all other governments in this country have listened to them because they are very fearful of the people organizing in movements like this.
Garrett, if you could leave listeners with one piece of advice or encouragement about staying engaged in protecting constitutional rights, what would it be?
Don't underestimate what your presence can do. Just being there, maybe not being seen or heard, reinforces everything we want about American democracy. If you can attend a city council meeting, that's good. If you can send an email to a local school board member or a county commissioner, that's good too. Now, there's going to be times when everything feels overwhelming, right? We're just soaked in this 24-hour news cycle that never ends. It's important to take breaks. Don't let them overwhelm you. Pay attention, be present, take breaks, because we have a long, long road ahead of us, but I am confident of success in the end.
All good advice. Thank you, Garrett. I really appreciate your legal expertise on this topic.
Thanks so much for having me.
Executive orders start in the White House, but they end up in community classrooms, health clinics, businesses, and courtrooms, shaping policies and changing lives. In Southern Oregon and across the country, people aren't just watching these orders unfold, they're organizing. They're showing up at town halls and protest rallies. They're pushing back. I spoke with two women who are certainly no strangers to pushing back. ORD2 Indivisible leaders Terrie Martin and Teresa Safay. Hi, Terrie. Hi, Teresa. Thanks for talking with me today.
Hi, Rhonda.
Hey
Thanks
there.
for the invitation.
For our first podcast episode, I think it's really important for our listeners to understand a little about the history of ORD2 Indivisible, as well as what the organization is up to today. So let's start with a bit of background. What moment sparked the decision to organize?
Well, it was the election of Donald Trump in 2016. It came as a shock to all of us across the country. We all sort of went into a free fall in terms of what do we do? What do we do? Two congressional staffers responded with a simple document they called the Indivisible Guide. which taught us all that you can't reach Trump, you can't really reach the White House, but what you can do is reach the people that represent you in Washington, D.C. So they taught us how to hold our elected officials accountable. So that's what we gathered to do. There were a lot of people interested. The two people that actually organized in the beginning were Jessica Sage and Brett Levick. And they basically made a Facebook page and say, hey, who else is in? And I guess the rest is history.
And I think it was overwhelming at first, the number of people. They started off in a rented library room in Ashland, and it just kept growing and growing and growing, and became over 3,000 members within the first few months, I think.
Wow. What made you two decide to get involved?
For me personally, I was not there at the very beginning, but a minute later, it was at the first Women's March after the inauguration of Trump. They estimate between 15 and 20,000 people were in Ashland that day for that march. And that was what helped me realize I wasn't alone. 3 days later was the first Trump Tuesday in front of the federal courthouse in Medford. And I thought, well, I'm just going to drive by. And if anybody's there, I'll get out of my car. If not, I'll keep going. I come around the corner and there were 100 or more people on the street at noon on a Tuesday. And I knew I had found the folks I wanted to work with. I particularly love that it's a nonpartisan organization. So we are not tied to any party. We definitely do our own thing.
For me, I was a journalist by trade and a journalism instructor. And we usually don't take sides on things. We're trying to be very close and in the middle of things. But the election kind of teed me off to become an activist and to actually take a side and to use my journalism skills and my teaching skills, which I think have come in pretty handy as we teach people about democracy, who represents them in Washington, D.C., and what they can do to make a difference.
I love the core mission of ORD2 to educate and empower people, protect the vulnerable, and hold our elected leaders accountable. I think that's very clear and very powerful. But I want to know, how have ORD2's goals or strategies evolved since its founding, especially in light of the political shift we're seeing today?
ORD2 and Indivisible in general started with only focusing on federal officials and federal issues. In the very beginning, we didn't have anything to do with state issues or county issues or anything like that. So the first real 4 years when Trump was in office, we focused on Greg Walden, our representative at the time, and all of the votes he took in Congress and his stands on everything. But this time around, we don't have Congress. We are out of power in all the branches. So we've found that what we have to do to create guardrails this time is to get much more active on the state and local level. That's the whole change for Indivisible this time around.
And how are you meeting that new shift? What are the strategies for that?
We have created teams so that our members have a place to dedicate themselves and activities that will keep them engaged. Through the teams, we are able to keep people going. The state and local team is the one that is specifically looking at state level politics as well as county level politics. They keep an eye on county commissioner meetings and are able to report back to us, and then we can create our actions after we've heard back from them about what's going on.
This first podcast episode is going to focus on executive orders. I'd like you to talk about how you see national executive overreach impacting our local community.
We are still waiting for the wave to get here in some ways. I feel like he's dropped the rock in the pond and the ripples are coming our direction. The initial things that we've seen, because of DOGE, for example, are a lot of federal workers being laid off at our parks and our federal land offices, BLM. A lot of people that are losing their job in that way. But we've also lost, for example, about $500,000 in contracts on water treatment plants in both Josephine County and Jackson County. We've lost funding for organizations like Lomakatsi, which do wildfire prevention. They've lost all of their contracting. We're just now beginning to feel the effect of these executive orders.
One of the strengths of Indivisible is that we pivot very quickly. We're not issue specific like a lot of organizations. If there's something going on with the migrants, we are all about supporting the groups that help organize for them. Whatever the issue of the day is, we have the ability to cover it and get our people engaged to try to let especially Cliff Bentz know what we think about what's going on. Looking forward to June 14th, which is going to be called No King's Day, happens to fall on Trump's birthday, and he's throwing himself a $60 million military parade in DC. Our goal with each of the big coalition rallies like this one is when Indivisible teams up with all of the other progressive organizations in the country to hold a single day of action. Each time we double the numbers from the previous time. We've heard numbers between 4,000 and 5,000 showed up on April 5th, and we're hoping to have between 8,000 and 10,000 this time. We'll be in Medford on June 14th between Crater Lake Avenue and Biddle Road on McAndrews Road on both sides of the sidewalk, lining the streets. That's one big local way. It'll let Cliff Bentz know that he's got a lot of constituents that are not pleased at all with the administration.
I know we have a committee that is looking at providing resources and protection for those vulnerable community members.
It's called the Community Protection Team. That particular team is very large with a lot of people working really hard to understand the issue and to support this community. We're also working with the ACLU Oregon in getting people trained on what to do if there is an ICE raid or if they think they see one. There's a lot being done to start protecting ourselves and to start protecting communities that we're trying to serve.
How do you help community members understand the connection between national politics and their local lives and why local action matters?
Yeah, well, part of it is that you just have to teach people about the fact that they have a voice. So many people don't even understand who represents them in Washington, D.C. I was stunned 8 years ago when I began this work when I'd say, who represents you in Congress? And they didn't have a name. Who are your senators? They didn't have a name. Who are your county commissioners? They didn't have a name. At this point, a lot of this has to do with educating people at the fact that you have people representing you on all these levels. And if they don't hear from you, they're going to do whatever they please. They are paid by your tax dollars, and you have every right to call them or show up at the meetings or do whatever you can to let them know that you agree or disagree with how they're representing you on whatever level they represent. And so to me, it's really important, just the basic level of education, to let people know there are people representing you. Do something. Put up your hand, make that telephone call, make those calls. Pick that phone up and call Cliff Bentz at every office, DC, Medford, and Ontario, and tell them, each time exactly how you feel, because you're going to be a tally on a sheet. At this point, they're going to say, I got this many calls today. Educating people on the fact that they have power, that they have voice, that even standing on the street corner with a sign makes a difference, because when you make the local news, they see it and they know that we care. To me, that's the most important part of the education and the part that I like best about Indivisible.
Make sure to make your feelings known because they're supposed to be doing our work.
Speaking to that point, if you were able to say anything to Cliff Bentz about his misrepresentation of ORD2, what would it be?
Well, where do we start? Truly, he recently sent a written statement to Southern Oregon Public Television for a documentary that was made by the Us As We Are program and called us a lot of names, accused us of hitting him with pillows that were bloodstained and supposed to look like babies from Gaza, which we did not do. He called us funded by George Soros, which we are not. He said that we were Ashland-based, which we are not. There's a lot of things that he said at this point, and so you can try to correct him. We do have our federal team that's meeting with his staff in Medford a couple times a month, which is great because they can go in there and actually give direct messages to the staff people there that can take it back to Cliff. We represent a lot of people. We have over 4,000 people alone in our Facebook discussion group, and our newsletter goes out to over 3,000 people now every Friday.
Well, organizing is very difficult, especially in times like these, as you two well know. So how do you sustain your hope and energy within the group?
I think remembering to take time to enjoy each other's company versus just nonstop talking about the struggle ahead is one way to stay engaged and keep people a little bit lighter in their feet.
all of us, we didn't know each other before Indivisible began. Some of my best friends have come out of this organization. And part of it is finding people that feel like you, that agree with you, and making that friendship and making it fun. We have a rabble rousers team that's going out on Interstate 5 and lifting up a banner that says resist and save democracy twice a week. They become great friends and they go out and hold up the banner for an hour. It takes about 10, 12 people, but they do it every week and they have a delightful time. Part of it is just friendship, finding people that care like you do, knowing that you're not alone in this struggle. And then there's also an element of self-care. This is hard work and you can't fret over it 24 hours a day. You still got to somehow make sure that you take care of yourself, spend time with your friends and family, take walks, meditate, and do all the things that keep you sane. But also doing the work helps. I go to bed at night and I know I've done something today in this fight. If I didn't do something today, I think that I would not be sane.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It does bring energy just knowing that you're doing your part. I think that's hugely important.
Everybody's going to indivisible in their own way. We've got people who love to be out on a street corner with a sign. We got people who want that bullhorn in their hands. We have people that say, I'll never be on the curb, but I will help you by staying home and organizing the files. Or I'll take the photos, or I will edit the newsletter. Everybody does indivisible their own way. And the good news is every bit of it counts. Every bit of it's important. I mean, if you're just home making your calls every day and never come to an indivisible meeting, that's okay too. You're doing it your way. So we hope to give everybody every opportunity that we have, that we know of, for them to do something and feel, I guess, sleep at night.
Yeah.
One good example of that was that someone reached out right after the inauguration and started the Knitter Resistors on Sunday afternoons in Ashland. They go out and they have their political signs and then talk to people about why they're there.
So anyway, we try to not just be angry, people on the street corner waving signs, but we want to support our community. We want this place to be a wonderful place to live. And that's what we're all about.
I want to personally thank both of you for all of the hard work that you are doing. It is truly making a difference in people's lives. I know that for a fact because it's made a difference in my life.
Thank you, Rhonda. This has been a wonderful opportunity to talk a little bit about the background, the infrastructure, and the things that we do every day. It's really nice to be able to get that message out in a new way.
Today, we traced a line from Executive Order 9066 to the flood of executive orders we're seeing now. We heard from poet Lawson Inada, who lived through the consequences. We broke down how presidential power works and how it's working on us. And we met local organizers who aren't backing down. History shows what happens when we look away, but it also shows what's possible when we rise up. If you're ready to take action, start right here at ORD2 Indivisible. Visit ORD2Indivisible.org and join the fight to defend democracy, because real resistance begins with us. Thanks for joining me on the first podcast episode of Row Resistance. Until next time, stay informed, stay active, and stay indivisible.